Hello everyone, I'm Katie Eakin-Ayala and this is the context presentation for Timour the Tartar and 1811 Britain. As a quick overview in this presentation, we will talk about the current events happening during 1811 Britain, about the political power that was in place during the time frame, some social proclivities, riots which we're referring to the Luddites, about the Georgian theater goers, about Orientalism as it refers to the play that we're going to read, and discuss briefly the Timour the Tartar itself. When it comes to current events, the War of 1812 was looming in the near future after Britain violated U.S. maritime rights, which was resolved with the ratification of the Treaty of Ghent in 1812. 1811 Britain had several wars in which it was experiencing, from the Napoleonic Wars that occurred from 1803 to 1815, the Anglo-Russian War that began in 1807 and was resolved in 1812, the Anglo-Swedish War that was also began in 1810 and resolved in 1812, and the Peninsular War, which began in 1808 and was resolved in 1814. It is clear to see that the time frame of current events was really impacted by all the different wars that were occurring during this time frame. It can be said that 1811 was a time of transition from monarch to regent, from the riots, war, and industrial movement, as a long-standing conflict with the revolutionary and Napoleonic France continued during this time, and invasion scares that occurred in 1798 and 1803. It wasn't until the victory of Waterloo in 1815 that granted Britain dominance over the countries, which was led by a successful victory over France and Spain in 1809. As the wars relate to the political and social needs of the land, they pushed the country more into the Industrial Revolution as the need for mechanics grew at an alarming rate. On the aspect of the political power, at the beginning of 1811, we had King George III, who was the reigning king of the time. And then we have his son, George, Prince of Wales, who took over in late 1811. As an overview, or as a review, known as the Regency period of 1811 to 1820, rather than the late Georgian period, the historical and political definition of the British time frame could be seen as madness, one part due to the relapse in King George III's mental illness in 1810, which would later be considered as a possible bipolar disorder. George, Prince of Wales, was renamed regent and governed the country until his father's death, and he assumed the title and throne as George IV until his own death in 1830. The Prince of Wales' induction as regent did meet with hesitation and took 2.5 months of political wrangling at the beginning of 1811 before the government granted it. Much of this hesitation could be assumed through the grand debt he incurred and resolved only to re-incur all over again, each time having the House of Commons decide on an amount to pay off his debts. Despite this push, as regent, George IV advocated for social and cultural development and highlighted the great and glorious epoch in British history, where a new era in painting, sculpture, decoration, literature, music, technology, and science flourished. This movement developed an art form and mannerism that would come to be known as Regency style and progressed even after his death. From a literary aspect, the late Georgian period was characterized by novels by Jane Austen and gave birth to famous and celebrated romantic poets such as William Wordsworth and John Keats, as well as paved the way for high moral seriousness rather than the robustly corrupt culture the earlier Georgian period displayed. Although, on that note, one mustn't forget the harsh government force on the working class. The war also affected the need for reform during the end of the Georgian era. With the height of the French Revolutionary War, growing agitations were hindered by claiming critics of the corrupt system of politics to be unpatriotic and dangerous revolutionaries, muzzling and ostracizing them. On the working level, the Luddites, which is a British reference to weavers and textile workers who detested, the mechanized looms of the knitting frames, had their most noticeable riots during 1811. Basically speaking, with the move of the Industrial Revolution and the wars that were pushing it, these group of workers were displeased with the factories that were creating or outsourcing them, and therefore causing them to not have work. On the working level, the Luddites, where am I? Had their most noticeable riots during 1811. With negotiations with factory owners going on unanswered, the Luddites continued rioting well into the 1810s, even going as radical as deliberately breaking machinery. While this was occurring, the Protection of the Stocking Frames Act that was inducted in 1788 was in place, and the government had hoped that factories would be protected and prevent these attacks. However, this did not hinder the Luddites by any means, and in 1811 alone, hundreds of machines were destroyed or broken by the Luddites. The March of 1811 being the most notable major riot, proved to show that their displeasure and frustrations were not going anywhere. However, to much the dismay of the Luddite workers, the government responded to the pleas of the factory owners rather than them, and began to attack, gun down, and even capture Luddites so they could be hung or sent to Australia to serve their punishment in an effort to appease the wealthy factory owners. Due to this extreme response to the riots, the Luddites' riots dissipated by 1813, and the Industrial Revolution reigned in the country. Also part of the industrial movement that was well underway, the Methodist Church came out as a church with an evangelical take on Christianity and had a larger attraction than the established Church of England. It was also during this time that the church pushed forward to educate the poor and promoted a national school system. When we talk about Georgians or the British during the time frame and how they were as theater goers, it can be said that they were not mere flies on the wall gazing upon the actors, but they were actual proud participants who created a carnivalesque atmosphere and actively engaged with the show so as to develop a chaotic and noisy performance, much like they were part of the play themselves. It was also around this time that the riveted Covent Garden accumulated audiences that would pay half price to sneak back in for the second show and cause riots. Be that as it may, the theater was a place where people from all social classes could come and enjoy the festivities. Mind you, they were separated by their designated areas in the auditorium. As the last dramatic work by Matthew Lewis, Timour the Tartar is an afterpiece that intended to follow the 1811 revival of George Colman the Younger's Bluebeard, or Female Curiosity, which featured live horses on the stage as part of the play. Based loosely on the 14th century historical figure and founder of the Timurid dynasty, Timour derives from Timour bin Targay Barlas, who conquered much of Western and Central Asia. As the context of this play highlights the Romantic era's Orientalist fantasies of exotic spectacles that yearned for a true pre-imperial character that was not tainted by English predispositions, Timour modeled after George Colman the Younger's controversially successful pantomimed operatic play Bluebeard, which included showmanship, music, and song. It was during the 1811 revival that the live horses were included, and again were used to their highest potential during the Mechanic Revolution for Monk Lewis's commissioned play. Following the same template playwright, Timour is a cruel and murderous usurper tyrant like Oba Malik, and stops at nothing to get what he so desires. As a whole, the context of the play can relate to the events occurring in British history. It can also be said that Timour of Tartar was a melodramatic representation of adversaries which most stubbornly challenged Britain's imperial aspirations. And with that said, here is the works cited used to create this presentation. I hope that we all enjoyed. Thank you guys.